Great, thanks very much. It's a great privilege to be talking in front of you guys and also sharing the results of some of the analysis that we've been doing. So today I want to talk to you about some work we've done with call taker strategies for initiating CPR instructions, and it follows very, very much on from what Tony was just saying about how things are phrased to the caller at that moment when they're seeing if CPR does or doesn't happen. So we want to know what works for achieving caller acceptance to perform CPR. So just a couple of quick acknowledgements. Professor Judith Finn, who she headed the NHMRC partnership project that this work happened in, and the authorship list there is really the group of researchers that was involved with that whole project. And that project had a really big focus on linguistics, and I think the vision Judith had to see the potential for linguistics, to find the meaning between the words, really paid dividends. And that came about when we recruited Marine Riot, she's the head author of this work, and Marine is a linguist. She's from France. And as Paul Bailey, medical director of St John Ambulance, has said many times, it's ironic we needed a French woman to come and teach us how to speak English. And also, who would have thought that, with linguistics, that words matter. We work within in WA, the dispatch system at St John Ambulance is the MPDS, so it's a very tightly scripted system, and what we were looking for is those nuances in how people actually use a scripted system and what happens between the lines. So just the context is this is obviously in the step 2 of the 10 steps, and in particular it's on the quality improvement part of it, and this is really about the measuring what happens and how important is what happens, and then really the improvement part is to follow. We haven't engaged with this particular piece of work with the comms officers yet, but that'll happen in due course. So a bit of background. In Western Australia, in Perth, there's an average of a median of 9 minutes response times for OHCA cases, so it's probably fairly in the ballpark of a lot of services. And as you know, those 9 minutes are very costly if CPR doesn't happen. And for 20% of cases, it doesn't happen. That sounds okay, I suppose, but these are the ones that I've focused on. If we talk about low-hanging fruit, this is an apple waiting to be picked. So this is bystander witnessed, non-traumatic, and call taker recognised cases. So we've got to the point where the CPR offer can happen, and for whatever reason, it doesn't get taken up. Now, of course, there are many potential barriers to CPR. There's situational barriers. The patient can be on a bed, or they can be in a difficult situation, trapped in some way. But we wanted to know how important is language in the mix of this, and it's not something that's really been looked at. Often when we talk about barriers, it's the situational barriers, or if it sometimes just gets categorised as caller refused. So we wanted to know really what's the language going on behind that. So our question was really, do the linguistic choices made by the call taker when they propose CPR to the caller, does that have an impact on acceptance to perform CPR by the caller? And if we can look at that variation and strengthen it, that's our ultimate game, our ultimate goal is to look at strengthening that link. So there's many different ways you can think about it. The various ways that a call taker can phrase this opening. You see people look at it as to whether it's a question or not, as a big dividing issue, or whether it's assertive or not. Given to a linguist, given to Marine, her approach on this was to go with a variable called the modality. And modality really refers to either the possibility or the necessity that it's expressed in the way people say things. And we use that all the time. So as a parent, you find yourself phrasing, if you want to know if your child wants to clean their room, in terms of, or do they think they're likely to clean their room? You need to do it, or you're just going to do it. We're going to clean your room. That's a whole range of different ways, and of course the responses, as for any parents in the room will know, that the responses can vary enormously. So if we look at futurity, so these are some different modalities that we categorise as part of this. So Marine identified these as, well, they're internationally recognised as different modalities, but they apply to CPR in these examples here. So futurity is that the caller will do CPR in the near future. It's a will or going to sort of statement. So the MPDS, the official script is listen carefully and I'll tell you how to do resuscitation. So it's going to happen. But it gets phrased other ways, like we're going to do CPR. Then there's obligation, which is that it needs to happen, it has to happen. So, we need to do resuscitation, right? Or, we have to start CPR. And then another modality is willingness, and that's really saying that the phrasing CPR as being dependent on the caller's desire to do it. So would you like to start CPR, or are you willing to try it? So there are other ones as well, but they're less common in this data set. So they're ability and likeliness. So do you think you're able to do CPR, or do you think you're likely, do you think you're likely to want to do this? So so a quick look at the data set we're looking at here. So this was across 2 years for cardiac arrests in Perth. Out of 3,500 cases of cardiac arrest, we selected 424. So there are a lot of the usual exclusions that you see with this sort of thing. So we removed resus not attempted cases, so the obvious deaths and the ones that were deemed by paramedics as not justifying resus. Remove traumatic cardiac arrests and EMS witnessed ones. And then there's some exclusions that are very particular to listening to call data, so it's where the audio was missing, where the caller or call taker was not a native speaker, where the caller mentioned CPR before the opening, as it's something that was happening or not happening, and when the call taker did not deliver a CPR opening. That might happen if the timing was just before paramedics arrived. So an important thing here is just that we included bystander witness arrests as well as unwitnessed. So we've got some arrests in here that were, they were the ones that are of lower survival probability. So that's worth keeping in mind. But really what we're looking at, it's a small selection of the overall data set. It's a real test tube, if you like, of what's happening in linguistics, because we've got a situation where it ideally should happen. So these are the data. This shows that this shows the overall proportion of all calls that were different categories. So futurity, which is the default, that's the MPDS scripting, or other ways of saying futurity, that happened in nearly half the cases. And 97% of those were initially accepted. So this is about the initial offer that happens. So it's a very successful strategy. And but the important thing is, nearly half of the cases aren't adhering to the script. And about a bit over 10% are phrased as obligations, something we need to do CPR. And that also has a high level of acceptance of 84. The one that really bombs out is willingness. So if you ask if the caller, you're willing to try CPR, only 43% of those result in acceptance. Then there are some other combinations. So futurity and obligation. So that might be, what we're going to have to do is commence CPR. So it's a combination of saying it has to happen and we're going to do it. That has a very high acceptance, 83%. And there's some minor examples, just even though they make up small numbers, they're worth keeping in mind. They involved willingness, but they still had a high acceptance rate. So it's more like the presence of futurity, saying it will happen, or the presence of obligation that's the important thing, rather than willingness. So then we thought, look, how robust are these findings? Is it possible that the call taker is just feeding off what the caller is saying initially, and they might be phrasing willingness as a way out for, or as softening the opening when the caller might have said that the patient is dead, that they're expressing no chance. So the possible confounding here is the patient could appear to the caller as being beyond help, and then the caller describes the patient as being deceased, and that might affect the choice that the call taker makes. At the same time, it's already influencing the acceptance to perform CPR. So it could all be set up without there being actual direct effect of the way it's phrased on the caller. And so we wanted to look into this possibility about whether the expression of the patient being dead, gone, some statement early in the call could be the confounder. So we stratified the whole thing, and we looked at when a caller did not describe the patient as deceased, we see very much the pattern, and it really dominates the data. It's 329 of the calls, out of 78% of the calls. It's the same pattern. Willingness has the lowest acceptance. It's still about half result in acceptance, and the other methods saying it's going to happen or it needs to happen, they still have very high acceptance. And so this is what happens if the caller says that the patient is dead early in the call. It's used, so it makes up about 22% of calls. We see here that willingness is used relatively more often, so it's used about as often as futurity. So this is a proportion of all the calls in the whole system of the 424. And we see that the use of obligation backs right off. So understandably, call takers aren't saying that it's something that needs to happen, because you can see that the choices of the call taker seem to be influenced by whether the patient's described as deceased. But what remains is that willingness is still an ineffective strategy, relatively. So the interesting thing is if the patient's been described as deceased, if they use futurity, it's still a very robust method. 95% of those are accepted still for initiating CPR. So this is really pointing to sticking to script. Now I apologise the third line of this is, I didn't update the numbers here, but the point here is that it's not just the initial offer that matters, and I'll walk you through where things ended up with the numbers, and so if we go down the left-hand side, of the 424 calls, 358 initially accepted. Now the next layer down is, so I'll take you over with the mouse, this should be 356, and down the bottom is 339. So if it's initially accepted, the final response is that it's accepted at the end of the call, and CPR actually happened as based on what paramedics said. In some cases, and this number is actually a 2, after being initially accepted, just 2 were declined later, and 2 of those resulted in no CPR. If we go down the other side, this is where it's interesting. 66 calls were initially declined. Now this over here should be at 25. So of the 66, 25 were subsequently accepted for CPR instructions. There was a second offer by the call taker, and 21 of those 25 resulted in CPR. So, and over here there was, of the 66, 44 remained as declined or throughout, 41 remained declined and they didn't receive CPR. So that's an important point, in that it's important not what happens just initially, but multiple attempts can be important. So this is take-home messages. Measure to improve is the mantra that we've heard many times, and this is a case of that measuring really shows, first of all, that this is a point of non-adherence to script that varies, that you can see really robust strategies. But one interesting point around that is that we've found this other category, obligation, which seems to be useful. And it's not the script, but saying that it needs to happen is quite effective. So if the first attempt doesn't work, that could be a really important backup strategy. So the take-home messages are that callers are more likely to accept dispatch-assisted CPR if it's framed as something that will or needs to happen, rather than something that depends on the caller's willingness. The use of futurity, saying it will happen, seems to be the most effective strategy, but obligation may be a useful secondary strategy if the caller initially declines CPR. Thanks very much.